Good afternoon. My name is Brian Liddy. Welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, the 25th of June. I'm joined in the studio by two guests today. We have Gordon MacIntyre-Kemp. Welcome, Gordon.
Pleasure to be here.
And we have Huw Williams, a regular contributor to Huw Marshall. Forgive me, my name issue has stepped in again today. Good morning, Huw. How are you? Good afternoon, Huw. How are you?
Good afternoon, found out.
Thank you. Huw, Gordon, you're a businessman and you founded Business for Scotland, and yesterday you were at the Dundee Convention, which we'll be talking quite a bit about later on. But I heard it said that you were a unionist who looked into the arguments being put forward for an independent Scotland with a view to dismantling them, and instead you realised that the arguments actually stood up. And you support the idea of a well-being economy, which again we're also hoping to be talking about later on in the show. Does that sum you up?
I don't think starting off by saying I was a unionist is the best way to sum up who I am. I was brought up in Hexham in Northumberland, which I think 5 years in a row won the Best Place to Live in England award. And I didn't know anything about Scottish politics or the Scottish economy. So round about the age of about 18 or 19, when I started beginning to understand a little bit more about Scotland, and I came to university in Scotland, I was not a nationalist. But when you say a unionist, don't think that I used to drape myself in the Union flag and, go to Tory Party conference or anything like that. I just didn't think that independence was plausible. So I thought I'll make an interesting university project. I'll look into this. By about 3 or 4 weeks of looking into it, I realised I was a nationalist, and I've been a supporter and campaigner for independence ever since. I just suddenly realised two revelations, if you like. One is that everything I'd ever been told about the Scottish economy was a lie, and later on I realised that everything I'd been told about economics was a lie. So that's probably the best way to sum me up, is that I've realised that.
Good to know. And Gordon, during the show, if you think that I'm asking the wrong questions as well as giving you an inadequate introduction, then please feel free to say so. Huw, sorry to keep you waiting. So Huw, you're a frequent contributor to the show, for which we thank you, and you're founder of The National, the equivalent of the Scottish National newspaper in Wales. You're currently setting up a new media platform, Talking Wales. How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. It's nice to be with you again.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll look forward to talking about Scotland and Wales together on today's show. So I'll go on to today's daily Ukraine update, and today is day 487. In an abrupt about-face, Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin said he had called off his troops' march on Moscow and ordered them to move out of Rostov. Under a deal brokered by Belarus, Prigozhin agreed to leave Russia and move to Belarus. He will not face charges, and Wagner troops who took part in the rebellion will not face any action in recognition of their previous service to Russia. In a statement, Prigozhin said that he wanted to avoid the spilling of Russian blood. Now the moment has come when blood can be shed, he said, therefore realising all the responsibility for the fact that Russian blood will be shed from one side, we will turn our convoys round and go in the opposite direction to our field camps. The Wagner leader was later pictured leaving the headquarters of the Southern Military District, the SMD, in Rostov, which his forces had occupied on Saturday. Wagner forces also shot down 3 military helicopters and had entered the Lipetsk region, about 360 kilometres, that's 225 miles south of Moscow, before they were called back. Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko's press officer was the first to announce that Prigozhin would be backing down, saying that Lukashenko had negotiated a de-escalation with Wagner head after talking to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Lukashenko said that Putin has since thanked him for his negotiation efforts. Putin has not publicly commented on Lukashenko's deal with Prigozhin. He appeared on television earlier on Saturday in an emergency broadcast, issuing a nationwide call for unity in the face of a mutinous strike that he compared to the revolution of 1917. Any internal mutiny is a deadly threat to our state, to us as a nation, he said. Putin reportedly took a plane out of Moscow heading northwest on Saturday afternoon. It's unclear where he went or where his current whereabouts are. Before the Belarus deal was announced, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that everyone who chooses the path of evil destroys himself. Whoever throws hundreds of thousands into the war eventually must barricade himself in the Moscow region from those whom he himself armed. Ukraine's military said on Saturday its forces made advances near Bakhmut on the eastern front and further south. Deputy Defence Minister Hanna Maliar said an offensive was launched near the group of villages ringing Bakhmut, which was taken by Wagner forces in May after months of fighting. Alexander Tarnavsky, commander of the Southern Front, said Ukrainian forces had liberated an area near Krasnorkiva, west of the Russian-held regional centre of Donetsk. So that's today's Ukraine update. Rather scary developments yesterday while the SNP convention was unfolding in Dundee. The Wagner Group's chief may have lost spectacularly, but Russia's dictator suffered a huge political blow. The coup is over, but Putin is in trouble. Isn't he, Gordon?
I really don't understand what's been going on here in terms of if the Wagner Group were going to start a coup, they should have followed through with it. I'm not saying that I would have wanted him to, because I think he's actually probably worse than Putin, and so really wouldn't want him to be in charge of anything. But tactically, why start and then stop? Especially he's gone to Belarus. Doesn't Putin have a track record of poisoning and assassinating everyone who's annoyed him, and no matter where they are living in the world? I wouldn't feel very safe if I was him. So if you're going to do it, follow through. It just seems that this whole debacle around the invasion of Ukraine hasn't had any competence, hasn't had any follow through. They seem strangely impotent as a superpower. And the only competent fighters they seem to have are the Wagner Group, and that obviously they saw that as a threat, undermined them. This has now happened, and who knows what's going to happen next. Is Putin weaker because of this, or stronger? You could say it both ways. You could say he's got control again and he's got rid of a threat. I just don't know. It's crazy to think just how totally uncontrolled and badly managed this whole thing is in Ukraine.
Thank you, Gordon. And Hugh, picking up on what Gordon said there, hasn't Prigozhin gone from being a powerful warlord with the power to topple Putin? She's gone from that to being a man living on borrowed time in a foreign country, waiting for Putin's inevitable wrath and retribution. Surely he's got sniper gun lasers trained on his forehead at the moment.
Yeah, it's all very, very bizarre, isn't it? Because, like I say, I was following the news yesterday on a range of different sources, and as you say, he was heading towards Moscow, then pulled off. But the alarming thing was he was heading to Moscow on the M4, so a lot of people in South Wales started panicking when they heard the M4 was involved. But as you say, he's the fact that he's backtracked, it just makes you wonder. I think probably he was under the impression that there was support within the Kremlin for him when he arrived, and I think he probably found halfway there that support had disappeared. That there was rumours about certain members of the cabinet, the Soviet cabinet, disappearing yesterday afternoon. So who knows? But like I say, I just think it just shows how much of a mess things are there. And I think Ukraine can only benefit from this because it shows that Russia isn't united in any shape or form. And now that they, what's going to happen to the Wagner Group? Now, are they still going to be able to rely on them? And they are, as you said, they're far worse than Putin, which is quite an achievement. But who knows? The next week or so will tell us more.
I think you're right, Hugh. I think everybody would probably agree that the only people to benefit from this is going to be Zelensky and the Ukrainians. I was kind of struck by the fact that Prigozhin got within a couple of 100 miles of Moscow, which is the equivalent of from here to the north of England, which then made me think of that historic event when Bonnie Prince Charlie got as far as Durham, wasn't it? When he was making his way to London, when he, where was it? Derby, yes, not Durham, it was Derby. Before he was given badly advised and turned back, when he could have gone all the way to London and stormed the capital. But we'd best move on. So our next story is about a just transition. Let me just get my notes on this. There's news that a new wind farm could be used to power a North Sea oil field. Forgive my paper here. Electricity from a new onshore wind farm could be used to power the biggest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea, campaigners are warning, ahead of an imminent decision over whether to approve the project. The huge Rosebank oil field is 3 times bigger than the controversial Campbell field that was put on hold more than a year ago. It has the potential to produce 500 million barrels of oil, and is expected to reach Grant Shapps and be approved by Rishi Sunak within the next few weeks. The idea is that this is going to reduce using a wind farm off the coast of Shetland to extract oil from a new oil field is going to make it carbon neutral, or help reduce their carbon emissions, or give it the lowest possible carbon footprint. So they're exploring options of sourcing clean energy from a wind farm off Shetland to do that. Hugh, I'll come to you first. Does this sound like greenwashing to you, or is it viable?
I don't understand the technology behind it, but obviously, we are in a position of transition, and I think it is something that, it is highly contentious. We have an issue in Wales at the moment where there's an open cast coal mine, because coal mining has been banned. Yet there's a coal mine here that's still operating, despite it operating against the law. Nobody seems to be able to stop them. But I think, from a transition point of view, I can see the argument that using Scottish oil would be better than importing oil from the Middle East and from the USA. And I think, as we've seen with Saudi Arabia, the way that they're trying to sort of work their way into sort of Western society through sport to sort of to greenwash their sort of credentials. It is a challenge. Obviously we need to stop using oil ASAP. But I can see the arguments from a transition perspective. Better to use Scottish oil than to import stuff from abroad.
Thank you, Hugh. Gordon, what do you think? I mean, is this a viable use of renewable energy, or is it greenwashing?
No, I think it's a viable use of renewable energy. As far as I'm concerned, yeah, it would be ideal if tomorrow we could actually just stop using oil. And not more than ideal, I mean, literally, the society as it exists right now cannot continue if we do not get our carbon pollution down, if we don't find ways to deal with global climate change. And so, yeah, ideally we shouldn't actually be drilling new fields. But it doesn't make a slightest bit of difference if we stop drilling new fields in Scotland. Instead of actually looking at supply from fairly small producing nations, we should be looking at demand for oil around the world, or oil and gas around the world, and trying to find ways to lower demand. So if you stop producing oil in Scotland tomorrow, and we could all pat ourselves on the back and say, great, what a wonderful job we've done cutting down carbon emissions. Except carbon emissions wouldn't move one bit. What would happen is other nations would supply, and Scotland would just not have any money from oil. And if we didn't have any money in taxation from oil, we wouldn't have the money to invest in renewables. And so basically, I think the only way to actually make this work for us is to tax oil, which increases the price of oil and gas. It might have some negative issues in terms of the economy, and actually put that taxation into making Aberdeenshire and the northeast of Scotland in particular the world's leading hub for renewable energy. And if we do that, we can undercut the price of carbon fuels and lower people's fuel bills, and and that will reduce demand much more quickly. So you've got to look at this pragmatically rather than just saying, I'm an environmentalist, I recognise the dangers, let's stop producing oil, because no one else is going to stop producing oil. In fact, they'll produce more to make up for the shortfall.
Thanks, Gordon. You mentioned there about making the North East a centre for an international centre for renewable energy. And to look at the wider picture, we've got everybody seems to be talking about just transitions. The Westminster Conservative government's talking about a just transition. The Labour Party are talking about a just transition, as are the SNP Green cooperation agreement. In Holyrood are talking about a just transition, but none of them are the same. I'm thinking especially about Labour at the moment, when they made their recent announcement up here in Scotland, which sounded like the equivalent of the oil grab from the 1960s and 70s. So which party or which group of politicians do you think has got the most plausible plan? Gordon, I'll ask you first.
I'm not entirely sure there is a plausible plan from any party right now. I think that the SNP and the Scottish Government overall have a good approach to it, but I don't think they're selling it very well. It's certainly not something you can take the massive investment that's required as a devolved nation. You don't have without the powers of borrowing or significant powers of borrowing. But in terms of Labour Party and the Conservatives, the Westminster politicians are doing the same thing as they've done over and over again. Do you remember there was the Build Back Better movement during the COVID lockdown, and everyone was saying we can build a more just society after COVID, and then the Conservatives adopted that and had it on behind them on the screens at the Conservative Party conference, and it said "Build Back Better," and then they've also taken the real living wage, and instead of having the real living wage, they called something the living wage. They just rename things and use them as slogans and don't mean them. And Labour, looking at Scotland's renewable energy, is looking at it with jealousy and thinking our entire UK-wide, and by that we mean the large populations of London and the South East, energy needs will be met by Scotland, and Scotland will once again not get the benefit, just as we didn't really get the benefit from oil and gas. It's the true deficit of being part of the United Kingdom, is that Scotland's greater GDP per head, Scotland's greater natural wealth is actually drained from Scotland and transferred to where the people live in the United Kingdom, and that's not Scotland.
Thank you, Gordon. And Huw, I'm interested in how it looks to you in Wales. With the Labour government in the Senate, is there much talk about a transition, a just transition there, and how does that relate to what Westminster says?
Yeah, it's one of the top priorities of the government, and obviously, this is one of the issues that I think angers Keir Starmer, is the fact that the Labour Party in Wales have a cooperation agreement with Plaid Cymru that came into force last year, and one of those parts of that is the setting up of an all Wales publicly owned renewable energy developer. So they're trying to take matters into their own hand, but it's only happening because Labour and Plaid, are acting like grown-ups and working together, because they realise that, from the planet's perspective and from Wales' perspective, this is how adults operate. And as you said, the fact that Keir Starmer toddles off up to Scotland to make this big announcements about GB energy, we can, it's clear what the approach there is and what they're trying to do. But it's in Wales, stuff is happening and it's happening at pace.
Thank you, Huw. I'll move on to the next item, which is Scottish independence. What has the Union ever done for Scotland? And as we've got you with us today, Huw, we're going to also consider what has it ever done for Wales. So we've got 4 bullet points here. We've got the economy and stability, development and infrastructure, cost of living, and culture and language. Huw, would you like to choose one of those to kick us off and say something?
I think it's a very short list because it's one of those questions I keep asking fans of the union is how does Wales benefit from being part of the union, and you can never get an answer of a positive response. People claim things like being part of having a combined UK army. Well, Wales has contributed sort of disproportionately to the armed forces over the years and lost disproportionate number of lives as a result. But if you look at things like it's the fact things like culture and language. The Conservatives, gave us S4C and they use it as a tool to try and sort of prove of their credentials. Well, obviously, if Wales was independent, we wouldn't just have one Welsh language channel and one sort of sub-English language channel. We'd have a myriad of channels as any normal country would have. So, yeah, I can't see any benefits, and I know that people try and say that without England's money that we'd all be in the poorhouse, but we're currently in the poorhouse, even with the supposed benefits that we receive.
Thank you, Hugh. I'll try and be a wee bit more focused on my question, and for you, Gordon. So, economy and stability. The one word that springs to my mind there is Brexit. Do you think is there anything to say there?
Well, no, I mean, the exact opposite is true in terms of has the union brought stability to our economy? Absolutely not. If you look at the sort of argument for staying within the union, I saw the other day somebody saying, well, the biggest argument is that we'll have freedom of movement of people and goods throughout the whole of the UK. And I thought, well, freedom of movement of people and goods, didn't we have that throughout the whole of Europe in the past? And Brexit has been the key contributor to the cost of living crisis. And we've also we've had austerity, which was supposed to put our public finances back on an even kilter. But actually, we've just seen GDP to debt ratio hit 100%, which is the worst it's been since the 1960s. So it's never hit 100% in my lifetime. Because it was the 1961 the last time it was there. There are roughly 130,000 households in Scotland because of interest rate rises and what that's done to their mortgages are finding themselves with 20% less disposable income than they had before. And that's really could be damaging to the economy because if they're not spending that disposable income in local shops, upgrading their homes, buying new clothes, those sort of things, which is the sort of consumer economies based on about 75% of it is consumer income, then that's obviously going to cause problems. The cost of food has increased 25% since 2019. So basically what we've seen is the crash in 2007. Since then, that wasn't just a crash, that was the economic system breaking, and it's never been repaired, and it can never be repaired. So we've got to think about new ways and redesign our economy. And hopefully we'll get onto this later on in the show, but the wellbeing economic approach is an attempt to do precisely that. And the UK is not interested in that. It's using the buzzword, the wellbeing buzzword, just as they're talking about renewables, all these sort of things, one nation societies and all these sort of things, and third ways. But they don't mean any of it, and they never deliver any of it. And it's absolutely crucial that in Scotland we start using the powers of the Scottish Parliament we've got right now to actually start putting projects in place that show people what it can be like, to show people if we had the full powers we could go in this different direction, because the broad shoulders of the UK just don't exist. There's never been investment in Scotland. We got lucky with North Sea oil once, we got lucky again with tidal energy and offshore wind in the North Sea, and for the second time we're going to see all of the benefits of that be taken out of Scotland and be told, well, yes, but you've got all these other benefits, and we just can't see them and nobody can name them.
Thank you, Gordon. We don't have much time left. In fact, we're pretty much out of time for this item, but I just want to ask you really quickly, Hugh, I'm going to roll a couple of things together. Another 5 minutes? Okay, I've misread the running order, but Hugh, Other things on the list were development and infrastructure, and I'm struck that here in Scotland, HS2, even though Scottish taxpayers are going to be contributing to the cost of that, the actual tracks aren't going to reach over the border here into Scotland, and I think that's the same in Wales, isn't it? And at the cost of living, I'm thinking up here in Holyrood, the Scottish Government is actually having to mitigate, or is spending money mitigating Westminster policies, but most recently there's that interest rate hike for mortgages, which most economists seem to think that it won't even work. Do you think then the result is in Wales is going to be, are people going to come to realise that this is the case, and is support for independence going to rise in Wales?
You would think so, but again, it depends on the messages that they receive. I think one of the issues is from a media perspective is the BBC is dominant here in Wales. From a newspaper perspective, Daily Mail and the Sun are still the most wide-read newspapers, even though the circulation, has dwindled. But obviously, a lot of people get their news online, from the Daily Mail, website and through Facebook. So it's the messaging that people get, because that is obviously the key thing that people have against independence, is the economic argument, because people just simply feel that Wales can't afford to be independent. There is this, idea that Wales is linked to England and is dependent on England for its existence and its finances. But as you said, with the Barnett formula, there are no Barnett consequentials with HS2 for Wales. So so we're contributing a couple of billion. Labour actually voted against, including that as a Barnett consequential. But I think Labour, I think in Scotland there are some consequentials. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But when you look at infrastructure here, we've got the M4 in the south and the A55 in the north. They're basically roads that link Ireland with England. That they're there for to transport goods across Wales, or they were used to extract coal and slate, whatever, out of Wales. So, infrastructure-wise, the fact that you have to travel via England to get from the north to the south by train will tell you everything you need to know about infrastructure in Wales.
Interesting point, illustration there, Hugh, thank you. And similar for you, Gordon, development and infrastructure. So I'm thinking that in the northeast of Scotland, the big carbon storage facility that was going to be built was blocked by Westminster recently, wasn't it? And for the cost of living, Holyrood mitigating Westminster policies and the interest rates hike. What do you think?
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? The spending by Holyrood to mitigate Westminster policies. It also, you can say that it does a lot of good for the families and eradicating poverty, etc. But at the end of the day, it also insulates them from the damage of Westminster and kind of makes it less important for them to actually think of a better way. So, when, on one hand, you're actually saying, look how much better things could be in an independent Scotland. But on the other hand, you're saying, well, they're not actually that bad here because we've managed to mitigate them. So it's a difficult balancing act. In terms of infrastructure development, the vast majority of infrastructure goes to where the population lives, and I'm not really, I'm complaining about that in terms of constitutionally. Scotland has a much smaller percentage of the population than London or the South East does. So if I was the Prime Minister of the UK, I would spend vast amounts of money in London or the South East, or I wouldn't get re-elected. It's as simple as that. And that's just a imbalance. But that imbalance has come about, that population imbalance has really come about due to years and years and years of money leaving Scotland. And I don't know much about Wales, but I would assume Wales, because why would they treat Wales any differently? And then being told that Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, etc., your basket cases, you couldn't exist without London's help, etc., etc. But as we started saying at the very beginning of the show, when I looked into the economics of Scotland, I couldn't find any evidence for the claims. I couldn't find any evidence for any economic benefit to Scotland whatsoever from being part of the UK. In terms of infrastructure, leaving the EU, so much of infrastructure in Scotland, and I know this is the case in Wales as well, has been funded by the EU. And that's one of the reasons that people in Scotland voted to remain in the EU, and that is not being replaced. It's just not being replaced pound for pound or euro for euro. And there is going to be a dearth of infrastructure investment in Scotland. And when it comes to renewable energy in particular, we are seeing multiple hydroelectric schemes being delayed due to Westminster. And we need those hydroelectric schemes, because if we bring on board all of the new offshore wind in particular, put it into the grid, the new upgraded national grid, when there's no demand for that, we need to store it. And hydroelectric works as a battery for renewable energy. Basically, you take the energy from the wind farms and you pump the water up the hill, and then when you don't have supply, when there isn't wind, etc., you use the hydro electricity. So they're just massive batteries, and there's multiple projects in Scotland being delayed. So there's no infrastructure boost for being part of the United Kingdom, because it's not part of the United Kingdom's priority.
Thank you, Gordon. Yeah, I did mean to bring that in. That Philippa Whitford spoke very well about that in Westminster recently, about those pump storage schemes. There are 6 sites apparently identified in Scotland that are shovel ready and ready to start work, but no shovels, apparently, as far as I'm aware, have broken any earth yet. So we best move on to the next item, the next 2 items, which are linked. So we've got Scottish independence, the how, and Scottish independence, the why, and this is all basically on the back of yesterday's SNP convention in Dundee. So the SNP's deputy leader, Keith Brown, MSP, welcomed the roaring success of the party's first independence convention yesterday, and it's heralded as a truly inspirational event, which stoked the flames of the independence movement. It was held in Scotland's Yes City of Dundee on Saturday, and it brought together activists, including yourself, Gordon, and the likes of Leslie Riddoch, and Wee Ginger Doug, the party leaders, and it kicked off the SNP's Summer of Independence. Gordon, I'll ask you, you were there, and you were a contributor, you were on the panel chaired by Kate Forbes. What was it like? What was your experience of it?
Well, first of all, for us to be actually invited, I'm not a member of the SNP, neither were the other 2 panellists. I'm not necessarily even a supporter of the SNP. I vote SNP tactically and may have to do so again in General Election 24. But the party that I'll vote for in an independent Scotland probably doesn't exist yet. And I don't think the SNP itself will survive independence. I think it will split in 2 and probably form the government and the main opposition. And there might be the left of the SNP merging with Labour. There might be a more central party as well. So it's not about the politics of the movement. It's about the route to independence, with the SNP as the key driving force, because it is the big beast of the Scottish independence movement. It's the lead political arm. And the fact that they were reaching out to to non-SNP contributors was, I think, a marked change from past conferences, where Leslie made the point that we've been actively discouraged from attending in the past. So I see that as a step in the right direction. In terms of how the conference went, for most of the time I was actually on my stall talking to people, so I had some great conversations, and people were very interested in Believe in Scotland. And Believe in Scotland is a collaborating group of 141 local and national Yes groups who campaign together. It's a kind of like a Yes Scotland, only grassroots-led version of it rather than headquarters-led. And that went down very well when we told people about that, and explained in detail how we actually manage ourselves. In terms of the SNP itself, I think Humza came across as giving a much more impassioned speech about independence, and dropped a lot of hints, quite strong hints, about the fact that he clearly wants to use the next election as a Scottish independence general election. and put pressure on using the powers of Westminster, which of course has control over the Constitution. So there is a legal argument there that says that you can say Holyrood doesn't have control over the Constitution, therefore it doesn't have the right to progress independence. But you can't say that about a majority at Westminster. So there might be a court case coming after a win for pro-independence parties. But it is what Humza was looking for, which is a legal route, and also independence is in Scotland a lot more popular nowadays than the SNP are. So it's a sort of life raft, if you like, for the SNP if their current polling doldrums continue to actually go after independence, which is what the party was set up for in the first place. So it's not exactly playing politics, it's their raison d'etre, it's what they're there for. So I think that's the route that the SNP now seem to be going down. They'll confirm that in their conference in October, I hope.
Thanks, Gordon. Hugh, I wouldn't expect you to have watched the whole thing online, being in Wales, but was there any coverage of the SNP convention, and what was that like, if you saw any?
Yeah, well, I didn't see any, but there was, on the news bulletins that I was listening to whilst listening out for what was happening in Russia, there was quite a bit of coverage, and it was quite refreshing to actually have them discuss the SNP in a positive light. You could almost sense that they were desperate to mention, the SNP's past troubles, but they managed to resist that. But so I think there's been quite a bit of attention towards it, and I think again, the fact that the conversation in Wales is slightly different. There was an opinion poll out, the most recent opinion poll showed that support for independence was 30% yes, and if you take out the don't knows, I think it was up to something like 33%. So it was slightly down on what the last one was, but when you consider what's been going on, and I think unfortunately, especially in Wales, you tend to find that people's view on politics depends on the performance of how the Labour and Conservative Party are performing in Westminster. So if the Conservatives are doing badly, it gives Labour a boost and it gives their policy platform a boost. Whereas if it's the other way around, which we don't get very often, it's easier for Plaid to push that agenda. But I think what is key, and I think it is one of the challenges, is the need to have that more diverse voices, who are supporting independence, because I think there is a danger. There was a discussion on Twitter about the dangers that the fact that the SNP and the Yes campaign are too closely linked. So there are people out there, as you just said, who aren't necessarily supporters of the SNP as a political party, who support independence. Which means that if the SNP do badly at the next general election because of the Conservatives and Labour picking up votes because of the media is giving Labour the coverage and Conservatives getting a kick in, then people put those links together. Whereas obviously in Wales, if you've got 30% who support independence, Plaid is still only polling around 10-12% in the Westminster polls, and even for the Senedd it's only around 20%. So I think it's important that there are more organisations and more separate entities who are involved in the independence movement, because there is a danger if one organisation has overall control. If something happens to that organisation, it can derail the whole shebang.
Thanks, Hugh. In general, I thought that the whole thing, I was watching at home, it seemed to me very corporate, very slick, which I suppose is what you would expect nowadays with the SNP. Leslie Riddoch's contribution seemed to be quite a useful, prickly sort of prod at the SNP to do things differently. If anybody follows her podcast, they'll know that that's a common theme in much of what she thinks of the SNP in Holyrood. But one of the stars of the show seemed to be Louise Smith, a 14-year-old from the Scottish Youth Parliament, whose point was that politics needs to be taught a lot earlier in school. But getting back to the how of independence, the SNP say that the first thing to do is to grow support for yes, and then the second thing to do would be to fight the next general election on the issues of independence. Thirdly, they must win that election, and then once they've won it, in Scotland that is, and then once they've won it, seek negotiations with Westminster to put independence into effect, and then finally set out a draft legal text to transfer powers to Scotland. Gordon, do you think that seems like a plausible plan?
It's definitely more plausible than we've seen before. I think there is still a lot of work to do on it. In terms of the route to independence, I talked on the panel yesterday about the route that Believe in Scotland has been working on. Back in February, we had a Scottish Independence Congress. The Congress had 241 delegates from, I think, 126 yes campaign groups, and they voted. 70% said back then that we should use Westminster as, at the time we were calling it a de facto referendum, but we don't like the word de facto, so we're calling it a Scottish independence election. And I think that's probably increased. I think the last couple of times we've got yes groups together, we've just found unanimous support for that. The reason for that is that, and this is something Hugh was saying before, that the SNP is seen as being very close to the yes movement or being the yes movement, but it's just not the case. There are hundreds of organisations that around Scotland that are campaigning for independence that are non-party political and have members from all of the pro-independence parties and many members who are just not interested in party politics. Right now, I just did a quick calculation there and found that of the last 4 polls, yes to independence has been at 50%. And in the last polls that I saw, the last 2 polls I think I saw, the SNP vote was down to 34%. So there's a 16% difference between the popularity of independence and the SNP. So if the SNP and the yes movement were one, you would see independence support drop, and we haven't really. There's been a couple of polls where it's been down, and there's a couple of polls where it's been up. So it's a bit more volatile than it has been before, but it's really locked in between 48 and 51%, and has been for quite some time. And until there's a campaign, it's not going to move. And so I think that that's one element of it. And that's why the SNP are looking at Westminster, because their purpose is to do what's best for the people of Scotland and to promote the cause of independence, to move the independence case forward. And if they go into elections and say this isn't about independence like they did in 2017, they get a kicking. They lost 16, 17 seats in 2017 when Nicola Sturgeon said, look, this is not about independence. Because if it's not about independence, independent supporters don't vote for the SNP. That's half of their entire purpose in life missing. So really they have no choice. They have to go to the Westminster election. It's the next election. You can't miss it. You can't step over it or ignore it. You certainly can't collapse the Scottish Parliament when you're in charge of the Scottish Parliament, because that's an abdication of responsibility during a cost of living crisis, during an inflation crisis, and probably during a housing crisis that may well start by this quite ignorant behaviour by the Bank of England. So essentially we're looking at Westminster, we're looking at finding ways to make the Westminster approach election trigger the beginning of the process of becoming an independent nation. The question is what that looks like. I suggested, or rather Believe in Scotland has suggested, that we reform the Constitutional Convention, that we get people from all across Scotland together, political parties, pressure groups, charities, churches, all stakeholder groups, and take that convention around Scotland, engage with local communities so that individuals get a say as well. And then it's the people of Scotland who are progressing independence, not a political party, and it makes it much more appealing to everyone. And that's kind of what we're pitching, and we're going to write to all of the party leaders in Scotland next week, suggesting that they get behind that route.
Okay, sounds good. So, moving on to the why of independence. So, Gordon, you spoke very well about the well-being economy and how when that's put into the mix, support for independence in polls that you've done goes up markedly. But I'm just wondering, I know we'll be talking about what you said in the show and opening that up, but do you think are there powers that Holyrood has at the moment that aren't being used that they could use to make a start on developing a well-being economy here in Scotland?
It's a more complicated argument than what powers they have, because you've also got to think about what financial levers they have. And you could say, well, you don't have power over energy, which is a problem clearly in terms of building a renewables base. But you could say the Scottish Parliament has the powers over heating. And therefore, you could put massive community heating programs in, like they have in Denmark, where many towns and villages in Denmark, people don't have individual boilers. They actually the hot water is pumped from a central storage place into your home, and it's much easier to protect people who don't have the money to turn on their boiler, can't pay their energy bills, etc. And the central heating system for a whole town can switch its energy supply to whoever's the cheapest more quickly. And it seems such a scheme would seem quite bizarre to us. But when I've actually told a Danish friend of mine how it works here and been told by other Danish friends who explained the situation to me, they just thought our system was bizarre. So you could say, well, we could do that. And you're right, we do have the power to do that. But we don't have the budget to do that. We don't have the money to do that. We don't have control over how we spend. So you have to take it from something else that's devolved. And what do you take it from? Do you take it from the extra child payment for carers? Do you take it away from the budget to eradicate poverty? Do you take it away? It's really difficult. So yes, they have powers, and a lot of people are frustrated that they haven't used those powers, but they also don't have the money and the financial powers to really do big, expensive projects that would actually make the case for much more. Would make the case for independence and raise those levels to the extent that some people want.
Thanks, Gordon. And Hugh, does well-being economy feature very much in the political debates in Wales?
Yeah, it's front and central. Wales has actually got a Future Generations and Wellbeing Act and a commissioner who oversees that act. But as Gordon was saying, the problem is a lack of levers. The commissioner has no teeth, so it's very difficult for to enforce things. And as you say, things like energy, there's a pilot happening in Bridgend along the Danish lines of having that shared system. I remember, and it shows you how long ago, I remember 30, 40 years ago, reading about Denmark, the system there of having water, surplus hot water from power stations being piped around, towns there. So we're so far behind the curve. And as you say, the vested interests of big business are to keep things as they are, and that is one of the big issues, and that is one of the big reasons for me for why we need independence, because clearly economically we need to do things differently, because the economics of Westminster, and you can actually probably struggle to get a Rizzler between the economics of Hunt and Sunak and those of Starmer and I can't remember the name now. Who's the shadow chancellor? Reeves. So and they're basically they're both they're the same cheeks of the same certain parts of the anatomy. So that's why we need change. We need radical thinking. On the flip side of that, you do have people in Wales from the independence movement, who are further right, who are around sorts of cultural, ethnicity and stuff like that. So, we have to be aware that, if we do have independence, Wales has never voted a Conservative government, which is something that we can trump Scotland on. So, the fact that we've been voting Labour But having said that, the most recent opinion poll still had Conservatives at 20%. And bizarrely and more alarmingly, they had Reform at 12% ahead of Plaid Cymru. So there's obviously something going wrong in politics in Wales and how people are understanding things, because people are obviously fed up of Labour in Wales and Conservatives in Westminster, but rather, looking for another option, they're looking at Reform, who offer nothing but, sort of small boats on acid.
Thank you, Hugh. Gordon, yesterday's convention, I've heard you say in the past that you think that old-fashioned economics just is not fit to deal with what we're facing now in the modern age, artificial intelligence and pandemics and the like, and you think well-being economies could help or could cope with those kind of things better. Feel free to say something about that, but I'd really like you to say something about your time on the podium yesterday, the points that you put across and how you thought they were received.
Okay. First of all, I want to come back to Hugh, and you can trump us with Scotland having, I think, in the 50s voted Conservative, but I raise you Brexit. But touche. The thing around the Scottish Government has, because of budget issues, been doing things to try and save money, such as making one police force for the whole of Scotland, one fire brigade for the whole of Scotland, etc. And you could accuse the SNP of centralisation, and it's true, but it's centralisation as a part of being a devolved power. And in terms of well-being, subsidiarity, taking powers right down, not just to councils, not taking power, devolving power from Holyrood just to councils, but from councils to community councils, and making decisions made by the people. So if you look at, even Paris is doing participatory budgeting now, and actually a certain amount of the Parisian budget is actually voted on how it's spent locally by local pressure groups and local communities, I should say. And so these are core ideas, things that sit at the core of the well-being economic approach, democratising spending, etc., which you can't really do in a devolved country. So that is one of the blocks there. In terms of the well-being approach, it is an approach that is happening all over the world. It is a trend. And Wales are quite rightly one of the leading countries looking at that and investigating it, but it's not being actually delivered anywhere as a whole. People are ticking this box and that box, and there's not an overarching strategy that says this is what the well-being socio-economic approach is. And in Scotland, I think the SNP's been very good at the social side of well-being. And mitigating the bedroom tax, the young carers payment, etc., reaching agreement with unions to give people the real living wage first, and then larger pay rises, which if you're a key worker you deserve. So these sort of things they've been getting right, but the Scottish Government hasn't had the business and economic side of well-being correct. And the whole purpose of this is to say that you can't have a strong economy without a strong society, and you can't have a strong society without a strong economy. So if you're only putting left-wing ideas in place with one particular government, then you're not maximising business. If you're putting the business ideas in place, you're not maximising society, and so we have boom and bust. So what we think is that the well-being economy is about getting the balance right, about simultaneously having what we call right and left-wing ideas about society and business implemented by the same government. And it's only a broad church like the Scottish Government that can consider doing that, because it has left and right wings within its own party who are held together by independence. And that's why I say they won't survive independence, because I don't think that Fergus Ewing and Mary Black are going to be the same party after independence. But that does give us a short-term advantage, because left and right ideas are mixed together, and people are beginning to realise that actually this is the way forward. And that is the key to well-being, is not being put in left and right tribalistic boxes, but actually voting in it for a more enlightened approach to economics. How did it go down? I immediately left the hall and went outside to my stall, and people were coming to the stall and they were saying, this is great, this is the vision we need. We need to stop talking about the process of independence and the detail of independence, the size of the desks that the civil servants will sit at. How do you set up a central bank? These are the things that every other nation that's become independent has somehow managed to figure out without spending millions of pounds and getting their knickers in a twist about. And what we need to do is actually focus on why. What's the vision of the country we want to create? How will things be better? And then asking people, is this a country that you want to live in or not? And they will say yes. And the reason that independent support goes up when you talk about the well-being economic approach and paying the well-being pension, which is the amount of pension it takes just to live with dignity and not to go further into debt if you're a pensioner who's reliant only on the state pension. When you talk to people about that, we do get support for independence rising to 60%. And people say to us, but that's not what the Scottish Government are saying. That's not what we've heard independence is about. So if you move the conversation onto the type of better country that we want to create and talk about the policies and the routes to that through the well-being socio-economic approach, the people of Scotland say, right, now I get it. Now I get what independence is about. And so, my message to Huw is start that process now before your first referendum in Wales, and don't get put on the back foot. Don't publish reams and reams of information about exactly how you're going to do this and how you're going to process bills between health boards, etc. Nobody's interested if you actually just say, here's a system of socio-economic system built on the core values of the people. Isn't this what you want? And the only way to get it is through independence. And then people will actually move in that direction, and it will be for the benefit of all the countries of the UK when the UK is no longer considered to be one state.
Thank you, Gordon. That sounds like sound advice for Huw there. But and Huw, I don't want to exclude you in any way, but Gordon, I'm still want to find. Well, I want to find out. From your time yesterday in Dundee, did you get any sense that the senior, the high Hegians in the SNP are going to bring your ideas on board?
Yeah.
Or is it a talking shop? Or
no, absolutely. The actual invitation to myself to go there was clearly a statement of intent and direction. The creation of a wellbeing economy cabinet secretary was even a surprise to me. During I spoke to all of the potential SNP leaders during the campaign, at the beginnings of their campaigns, about their ideas. I gave them all, or rather the two that asked me, which were Kate and Humza, asked me about the wellbeing data and research that we've been doing, and Humza basically just said, right, that is it. That's exactly the message that we want to give as a party, and he basically based his campaign upon it. So yeah, he's very definitely committed to it. I am seeing right across the board in my interactions with Scottish ministers. First of all, they're much more approachable than ever before. We've had more engagement with ministers as Business for Scotland and Believe in Scotland since Humza took over than we did in all of Nicola Sturgeon's time, which tells you something. And yeah, so their intent is there. They are committed to this, and we're meeting with them on a regular basis to share our think tank Scotianomics research with them, and they're sharing their research with us. And yeah, I think that is definitely the route that we are going to go. We're going to put the well-being socio-economic approach at the heart of the case for independence, and that will get support up to near 60%.
Great, thank you. And Huw, we've got about a minute left. Do you think, what are the chances that the Senate are going to take Gordon's advice?
I was wanting to shout hallelujah when Gordon was speaking, and I think that's one of the issues in Wales, is the fact that Labour here are far more progressive. That's exactly the vision they have for Wales, is what Gordon was saying. But they're obsessed with saying we can only achieve this if we're part of a union with, and I know they want to get, the Gordon Brown's old federalism, but they just can't, understand a country with 84% of the population isn't going to cede all that power to, to Wales and Scotland. But I agree completely. In Wales, the problem I see with the independence movement is the campaigning is all negative. It's all directed towards Westminster, isn't working. So once the Conservatives go, which hopefully will happen at the next election, it'll be interesting to see, what happens, because, they won't have that target that they've had previously. But no, I agree 100%. We've got to offer a vision for a better Wales, and the only way we can do that is through being independent.
Thank you, Hugh. So that's about the end of the show. I'd just like to thank you both, Hugh and Gordon, for giving up a huge chunk of your weekend on this Sunday afternoon and for sharing your thoughts and ideas. I've really appreciated it. I hope you'll come back again, Gordon, and Hugh. I'm sure we'll see you again sometime soon. But that's about it for this week's Full Scottish. Before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Right now, we have a pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay our bills and to ensure that we are able to continue making programmes like this one. So thank you once again to Huw Marshall. Thank you, Gordon MacIntyre-Kemp. See you both again, I hope.
Cheers. Thank you very much for the invite.
No, not at all. Anytime.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you for watching.